Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us to Why Marx. We're back. Summer break is over and just as well. We're very much looking forward to restarting discussions with you. And, if you want to make a contribution, have a question, please click raise hand at the bottom of your screen. Tonight, we've got two sessions, two subjects we're discussing. The first one is Kneecap, Irish Belfast-based rap band, and they've released a film, and we're going to have a quick discussion on that, and then we're going to discuss fascism, Trotsky on fascism, and what are the movements today that we're seeing, the rise of the far right. So we're going to start with a Kneecap discussion. Unfortunately, the speaker, Billy Clark, can't be here tonight, so I've interviewed him earlier today. If you want to discuss the issue, you can discuss it with us if you want. So click raise hand during the video or just after, and we can bring you in. So I'm just going to share my video and let's have a look.
But not this one.
Sorry, I'm going to start again from the beginning.
You know
Apologies.
Every story about Belfast starts like this. But not this one. This is Nisha and me. And we found our calling, giving the middle finger to the Brits.
This is an Irish interpreter.
That.
Do you speak Irish?
Aye.
That'll do.
Why don't you just speak the Queen's English?
Mighty military and Lennox so the bag of lobbies focus up and day and it's the E have worked on Mark Geller and Yanker men with the LR for the true and
What's the ready? You'll like that, you're going to get it. There's a good studio again. Obviously, it's been short kill, I laid down less. Oh, come on, let's go. American, you'll see her. Can you do Dr. Drainer again? Sir Reagan, the National Dini, the hip hop in the hair. Tour Coustin, I can't. Can't far. If I
Speak English.
there's a word Gaelic. Gach fuckle Gaelic literature.
Shapiro is killed there sensation. Like I discovered the Beatles. It's a Beatles wish.
You speak Irish, but you don't understand the language.
No, how am I going because of you? You have a life. Never I can take it all away from you like that.
Discrimination, censorship.
Don't make me come down there.
I'm a hit! Double OD! Low life!
Look at me. No more music. Short hours feel. Something like that. You hear Abby Rody?
Abby what?
So here to talk to us about this extremely entertaining and political film is Billy Clark. Hi, welcome, Billy. Can you tell us, as an Irish fan, how did you come across them and how do they speak to you?
Well, I'm only part Irish, but I have a really strong interest in both Irish traditional music and the Irish language, using it and learning more about it. I have tried to curate my social media so that most of what I see is people who use the Irish language predominantly. So it was inevitable, but I'm not really a hip hop fan. It was inevitable eventually I'd come across them. Kind of every Irish speaker, Irish learner was talking about.
And I'm not an Irish learner, but I've come across them, of course, for their political views, etc. Yeah. They've been, causing a lot of havoc. So the film is a sort of fictional origin story. How much of it is true? I mean, the guy, for example, the guy who always wears the balaclava, Provi, he's actually a teacher, or was a teacher, wasn't it? There's some things that are actually true.
In lieu of an official biography, I've gleaned most of this from the interviews that they've done, and they've said that they don't want to exactly spell out what is true and what's not true, just to keep a bit of mystery, which I can understand. But there are some pretty interesting things, like you said, DJ Provi or JJ O'Doherty was a school teacher, and he was sacked for his involvement with Kneecap. So that's true. In the opening scene where Nisha is having his baptism in that secret place and the British helicopters find him, and they think they found an RIA training camp. That's true. I think the whole getting their heads kicked in by the dissident Republican anti-drugs group isn't true, but they have said that they had death threats from dissident Republican groups more than they did from unionists. So it's loosely based on truth, but it's a mix, as you'd expect.
Yeah, it's a big thing in the film that RT, the official Irish channel, banned them. Is that true to your knowledge?
Yeah, Radio na Gaeltachta, which is a radio station that more or less only has Irish language content. I think they can't be on there, which I feel conflicted about because I really like Radio na Gaeltachta. Although there have been some less hostile kind of interviews with them now on television, it's still, not something you really hear about them on RTE, and there certainly was a ban. TG Cahad, which is much better television, they have promoted Kneecap a fair bit.
There's a funny interview with them on the Late Late Show with Patrick Kilty, and I think that's been really spread around quite a lot. They were told beforehand, not to wear any Palestine badges, I understand, and so they all came zipped up, and then as soon as the live interview starts, they open their tops, and one of the guys probably has a Palestine football shirt on. So the film concentrates very much on the Irish language issue, but in interviews like that, they've also been very outspoken in their support for Palestine and calling themselves communists and socialists, etc. Do you think that's down to funding, perhaps? What's that the film is sort of all about the language, really?
It might be. It has funding from the British Film Institute and Screen Northern Ireland and things like that, which perhaps limits them. I think, though, and obviously I don't think Palestine really comes up in the film, but I think they do well considering those constraints. Like, there are some political issues that they can address, and so given their image and given the accusations against them, obviously they have to try and challenge sectarianism in a principled way. And I think perhaps other than the chief of police, the characters in it who are from a unionist background have quite a positive portrayal. Even the scene where he steals the stick off the flute band and he's running away with it, you don't really feel the threat of that. That's just pure comedy. So I feel like they deal with sectarianism in quite a funny way. The character of Georgia, who I think is a very sympathetic character and is British, and you see her learning Irish at the end as well. Other political issues, I think, obviously drugs is a big one.
That's an interesting issue, isn't it, with the drugs, because there's a lot of drugs in the film. It reminded me a bit of Train Spotting. It's also reminiscent a little bit of Monty Python and the radical Republicans against drug abuse. And there's also some other Republicans against drugs, etc. So they are taking the Mickey out of that one.
I was watching it and it occurred to me, I think it was implied that a lot of the problems to do with drugs and the violence that stems from it is to do with its criminalisation and the over-policing of it. Most obvious in their songs, obviously their first single, Character, is nearly all about, it references other things, but it's nearly all about drugs. And then songs like Ifiach Lina on their album that came out this year, they're making it pretty clear that they're not going to stop talking about it just because it upsets some people.
There's also a character, which is the father of one of the guys, is an old Republican fighter. He's hiding. He's been in hiding for 10 years because of the operation. Which fucking operation is his ex-wife, still wife, asked him, he basically set some cars on fire and stuff. So these guys are, they're modern, young Republicans. They're clearly quite critical of the old methods, but they're still in favor, I guess, of Irish unification. How is that political issue being discussed?
So the phrase they're brought up with is every word spoken in Irish is a bullet for Irish freedom. It's a great saying, but they're saying, I think, enough bullets have been fired on the issue and enough metaphorical bullets as well. Not every use of the Irish language, not every promotion of Irish culture needs to be political. It needs, for it to be a living language, it needs to be used for everything, not just for political statements and so on. So I think with their music, but also with this film there. And I think that there's an increase in acknowledgement that whatever form the United Ireland is going to take, it's going to need to have a place for unionists or people from a unionist background to fit into that. They're not all going to go back to Scotland. So, it's going to have to take on some form that benefits all the cultures of Ireland, and I think that's a lot easier. Although they do have the tricolour balaclava and things like that, and a lot of the stuff that they rap about, you wouldn't necessarily assume it.
It is still a demand, a United Ireland, get the British out, get the troops out, that they make a big thing, and, he's showing his ass with it, in concerts and said Brits out. They clarify later, we don't mean you, I don't mean you, my girlfriend, you're British, but, in Northern Ireland, I don't mean you, I mean the British state out of Ireland.
It reminds me a little bit, I was in Belfast recently, and when there's this amazing, massive mural, very friendly looking mural really, which says Fáilte go bhfuil feisteach here, welcome to West Belfast, and then you go around the corner and there's loads more, but it says like PSNI, Police Service of Northern Ireland, not welcome here, because they've had a couple of murals put up in Kneecap Ave, and during those they've said and asked all the people there to agree with them, whichever side of the peace war you're on, we're both we're all working class, we're all suffering under the same system.
But what kind of communists then are they, to your knowledge? Have they talked about that a bit?
I think you tend to find with musicians and artists in general, they are less likely to be organised as communists than other people, which is mostly based on the late interview where they said, we support a workers' revolution, not one based on a God that might not exist, not one based on being Catholic or Protestant or something like that. And I think that's the important point really is, I agree with obviously support for United Ireland, but it's not the case that any old United Ireland will do. It won't automatically improve the strength and the position of the working class. I think in the British context, you could see it as obviously any communist programme should call for the abolition of monarchy and the House of Lords, but that's not going to automatically be a gain for the working class. There are, some places that are republics that you certainly wouldn't want to live. I wouldn't be surprised if they never kind of attach themselves to a particular programme or party, but I'm happy that they have at least said they support a workers' revolution above all else.
Absolutely, and it gives the idea of communism a new impetus, doesn't it? If young, cool, rappers use words like that and talk about workers' revolution, that can only be good for us, and it certainly got them onto our radar and into the pages of the Guardian, etc. So they're all celebrating them, which is cool. Thank you very much, Billy. That was really interesting. Oops. It certainly was very interesting. Comrades, if you have a chance to see the film somewhere, go and see it. It really is very entertaining as well as quite good politically. There is actually a Palestine flag in the window somewhere, but I do think they probably had some funding issues in terms of keeping quiet about that issue. But it is very entertaining. If anybody wants to speak about that, put your hand up. I can't see any, so I think actually we're going to move on to our second issue, which is the question of the summer riots, the rise of the AFD, in Germany, Alternative für Deutschland. You got in the Netherlands, obviously run by a right winger. There's been a general rise, and that's been an international phenomena of the right, whereas the left doesn't seem to make any headway out of the crisis of capitalism and is getting smaller and smaller, unfortunately. So we want to discuss a few issues around that. Ian's going to start with a look at Trotsky, what he had to say on fascism, and to find a definition of it. And then Matthew is going to have a look at some of the groups and organizations that have been rising up recently. And then we can have a debate, a discussion with the audience and amongst the two speakers about how to counter fascism, how to counter fascists, wannabe fascists, and the right. So we're going to start with Ian, who's going to share his screen, and we're going to turn ours a little off. Thank you, Ian and Matthew, for joining us.
Yeah, I can't see the share screen button at the moment.
Bottom of your screen.
It's not.
Usually on the bottom, share, the green button.
Let me see. Oh, there it is.
Phew.
No.
Had me worried there for a bit.
Yes, I like to keep you on your toes.
It certainly worked.
Well, good evening, comrades. In the light of riots and elections of far-right individuals, the upcoming US presidential election, the far right in Israel carrying out genocide on a biblical scale. I think this is an apposite moment to talk about what Leon Trotsky had to say about fascism. There are lots of reasons to read Leon Trotsky. He was one of the finest writers of his generation. But his analysis of fascism is superb, not least of which because, of course, he was writing at the time. This isn't some kind of analysis after the event. I mean, he was there as a kind of witness, as it were, to the rise of fascism and the subsequent consequences. And I think it's important that we appreciate just what Trotsky was saying about it, because I think crucially, for Trotsky, fascism isn't just about being right-wing, nationalist and authoritarian. So, for example, he talks at one point about the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, who was dictator of Spain between 1923 and 30. And doesn't really talk about him as a fascist as such. He might be right-wing, he might be nationalist, he might be brutal, but he isn't a fascist in the same way that Franco took power, and moreover, certainly not in the same way as Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany. So it's not enough then just to talk about fascism as someone we don't like. The tendency is on the left to just call anybody a fascist who we happen to find particularly distasteful. I've heard people like Priti Patel being called a fascist, and of course Nigel Farage is occasionally cited as being a fascist. I don't think Trotsky would agree with that analysis. So the important thing for Trotsky was fascism isn't something that you can really just describe in the way, for example, that Franz Neumann did in his epic book Behemoth. Franz Neumann was a member of the Frankfurt School, and he did a kind of sociological analysis of German fascism. But for Marxists, and Trotsky in particular, what was important was to understand fascism as a movement, as a relationship between the classes that were antagonists during the period of the 1920s and 30s. So, for example, we have a situation. I mean, fascism isn't necessarily supported by the ruling class. And we wouldn't see fascism being supported necessarily by the ruling class today. It's generally not good for business. But in the context of 1920s Italy, in the context of 1930s Germany, it was important for the ruling class to have a movement that would crush the working class, and above all, crush the organized working class, whether it was in the trades unions, whether it was in social democratic parties, or any other means, and particularly, of course, if it was organized into a revolutionary communist party. And that's exactly what the ruling class did, prepared to form an alliance with fascism, which Trotsky would argue actually has its mass base in the petit bourgeoisie. So If you're looking, for example, at Italy or Germany, there was a massive peasantry at the time. There was a massive small bourgeoisie, petit bourgeoisie, so shopkeepers, and also interestingly, sometimes in liberal professions, found a great deal of support. People in liberal professions were significant supporters of the Nazi Party, for example. And some of them, of course, made their careers by supporting Hitler and disposing of the Jewish professionals who they might be competing against. The other aspect of fascism, of course, that was important when Trotsky was writing is that both Hitler and Mussolini had effectively party militias. They had people who would be prepared to go out and fight and kill communists. And this was an important feature of the time. So, for example, when people talk about Tommy Robinson out on the streets in London, I'm not denying for a moment that some of the people out there are fascists or neo-fascists, indeed even neo-Nazis. But to describe it as being fascist in the same way, for example, that Hitler's party was a fascist party, is, I believe, a mistake for a number of reasons. And I think the use of the term fascism as an epithet causes all sorts of problems when you then try to have some kind of relationship to the working class as a whole. And what you're finding, in fact, is that not only are large numbers of workers sympathetic in some ways to nationalism, sympathetic in some ways to the idea of a restriction on immigration. And indeed, this finds its expression in the Workers' Party of Britain or in Sarah Wagenknecht's party in Germany. The other aspect that I think is very important to look at, and we will, is the position of Stalinism and how, although fascism, for example, in Italy predates Stalinism, the Stalinist line was also important in terms of the victory of fascism, in particular in Germany. And of course, the disastrous policy on the part of the Comintern of describing the German SPD as social fascists, preventing the possibility of a unity between communist and social democratic workers on the basis of being workers. And instead, this meaning that any kind of so at no point, for example, did Hitler have a majority of support, and certainly not among the working class as a whole. It was, moreover, widely understood that Paul von Hindenburg, who was president of Germany at the time, absolutely despised Hitler, the vulgar little corporal, but nevertheless was prepared to appoint him as chancellor in opposition to the possibility of a socialist taking power instead. So what we see, for example, then in German fascism and indeed in Italian fascism is really a petit bourgeois base, sometimes accompanied by parts of the lumpen proletariat, that is, declasse elements or unemployed workers, although the majority of unemployed workers, even in Germany, tended to support the Communist Party. And the other aspect I think is important is what kind of attitude should be taken to right-wing populist political parties today. One of the features that was so disastrous in the context of Germany was the idea that somehow, well, if the fascists take power, people will soon see through them, they'll soon fail, and then it's our turn. And that arguably was the almost final straw, really, the absolute disaster, because, of course, immediately Hitler took power, he started to crush the organized workers' movement, leaving the working class in an atomized state. So just let's have a little look at the context then. This is a rather dapper-looking Benito Mussolini in 1917. The bundle of sticks with the axe in it is the fasces. And that's where, of course, the word fascist comes from. It was, of course, originally the symbol of the magistracy in ancient Rome, the kind of power of the Roman state. So there isn't really time to talk about the Italian Socialist Party in any great depth itself, and it would be an interesting subject. But it's worth remembering that actually Mussolini was on the left up until the First World War. He was the kind of leader of the maximalist group, along with people like Antonio Gramsci, prior to the First World War. Reformists, by contrast, were followers of Filippo Turati. And of course, this kind of mirrors the kind of division that you had, for example, in the French the French Parti Ouvrier. And of course, the Italian Socialist Party was almost, well, not unique, but unusual in the fact that it didn't support the First World War. What you tended to get, though, was that those who did, including Benito Mussolini, was that they tended to leave and instead join national syndicalists, using the rhetoric of they'll form a kind of a revolutionary opposition to reactionary regimes such as Austria-Hungary, against the aspirations, for example, of Istria being allowed to be part of Italy. The other important context about the rise of fascism in Italy, of course, is revolution. We often hear of discussion around the revolution in Germany. We'll look at that again in a moment. But of course, in the period from 1919 to 1920, the Biennio Rosso, we see factories being occupied by workers councils being thrown up, and effectively a revolutionary situation in the north of Italy. Arguably, the Italian Socialist Party didn't make nearly enough of this, and what you instead ended up with was a movement which was gradually defeated, and in no small part by the fascists themselves. So especially in Milan and Turin, the main industrial centers of Italy, and there were over 1 million workers involved in the movements around the Biennio Rosso. In July 1919, there was a general strike in solidarity with the Russian Revolution. And this was all against the context of massive unemployment in the period after the First World War, and major disappointment that, in fact, Italy didn't really get very much out of the war, notwithstanding their support and fight against Austria-Hungary. And then, of course, leading ultimately to Mussolini's coup d'etat, the so-called March on Rome in October 1922. So that's the background of not only the Italian Socialist Party, but the background to Italian fascism. And again, as Trotsky outlined, here is an alliance between people who were prepared to put down a socialist revolution, allied with the petit bourgeoisie, and supported by the haute bourgeoisie as a preferable alternative to the possibility of a socialist revolution. The story in Germany is perhaps a little more familiar to most people. In 1919, the young German Soviet Republic was drowned in its blood, crushed by really the army and the Freikorps. The man standing next to Hitler is Ernst Röhm. Those are his dates there. He was an army officer in World War I, and therefore very susceptible to this idea of the stab in the back theory of why Germany was defeated, and was effectively the leader of what we might call the left of the Nazi Party. And if that sounds utterly bizarre that the Nazi Party had a left wing, here is an example. There were other people who were part of it, such as Gregor Strasser. And the point about Röhm, and he was the Stabschef of the, you're going to have to forgive me, Tina, Sturmabteilung, the SA. So he was leader of that, and subsequently invited into government as Reichsleiter in 1933. Hitler and Röhm enjoyed a very close comradely relationship. Röhm was one of Hitler's oldest comrades. After the SR was effectively decapitated, the SR was never disbanded. It effectively stayed it officially existed right up until 1945. But it was decapitated, and people like Gregor Strasser and Ernst Röhm were executed. Röhm, as I say, was one of Hitler's oldest comrades, and Hitler prevaricated for days before he finally agreed to have Röhm shot. Ernst Röhm, why I describe them as it were, as the left wing of the Nazi Party, would talk in terms of the need for a second revolution. The first revolution, of course, being when Hitler took power, but the SR were frequently arguing for the needs to for some kind of removal of power from the bourgeoisie, and for that reason, although Paul von Hindenburg allowed Hitler to become chancellor in 1933, the increasingly radical statements of people like Gregor Strasser and Ernst Röhm caused a great deal of alarm with the bourgeoisie in Germany. The price, effectively, for staying in power for Hitler was to remove this left wing. And that's what we saw in the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, when they were summarily rounded up. And many were shot out of hand. Röhm was held in prison for a few days before finally he too was shot. Against the background of all of that is also the actions of the Comintern. And Trotsky's writings are full of criticisms of the twists and turns of the Comintern in this period. So on the one hand, you have Trotsky's insightful analysis of the balance of class forces in Germany and in Italy, and of course later in Spain, but there isn't time to talk about that this evening. And on the other hand, there is his critique of the Comintern. So the Comintern, established in 1919, following the disastrous failure of the Second International, initially under the chairmanship of Grigory Zinoviev, who was, of course, later kicked out of his position, subsequently kicked out of the party in 1927, allowed back in again, and ended up in an alliance with initially with Stalin against Trotsky, and then with Trotsky against Stalin, but then by then it was too late. The point is, of course, that the Communist International itself had a number of twists and turns in the Second World Congress. Among its decisions with the various conditions for joining the Communist International. So one of which was, for example, to expel the kinds of opportunists who had supported the First World War. So for the Socialist Party of Italy was one of the first parties to try and to affiliate, in fact, to the Communist International. One of the conditions, though, was that they should kick out people like Turati. Effectively, then the Italian Communist Party split, and the Italian Socialist Party split, and the Communist Party of Italy was founded in 1919. In the Fourth World Congress in November 1922, we start to see Bukharin formulating theories not only around the idea of this was a little later, formulating ideas around not only socialism in one country, but the importance of the periodization in the period. So the first period being of revolutionary socialism from 1917 onwards, the second period where you have a consolidation. Now, bearing in mind that the Fourth World Congress took place in November 1922, just shortly after Benito Mussolini seizing power. And so Bukharin, in his analysis of this, was starting to say, well, we've entered a different period, a period of consolidation where the ruling classes were consolidating its position. And you see united fronts being advocated, for example, by Trotsky against, for example, fascism, both not only in Italy, but also in Germany. And disastrously, of course, the third period in the Sixth World Congress in Moscow in 1928, an opposition to reformism being put forward by the International, where, for example, the German SPD was described as social fascist, making the possibility of any united front between the SPD and the KPD, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, Social Democratic Party, as absolutely impossible. And of course, what you also got was this disastrous policy of saying, well, let the Nazis take power, they'll make fools of themselves, and then it's our turn. Because after all, Hitler's share of the vote actually went down at the point just before he was appointed as Chancellor. What we then also see, of course, in the Seventh Congress. After the shock of Hitler actually taking power and starting to smash the organized workers' movement, the so-called Popular Front. So that's a brief outline. The important thing here to sum up is that Trotsky wasn't just arguing that fascism is just authoritarianism, not just nationalism, not just people we don't like. It was a precise analysis of the kind of social forces that were taking place, and a precise analysis of the base of fascism as an alliance, really, between the bourgeoisie and the petite bourgeoisie. A petite bourgeoisie which, under conditions of revolutionary socialism, will be dragged along with the proletariat, which would ally and see its interests as being alongside the proletariat. But in conditions of defeat, becomes, as it were, fascism then becomes the ideology of despair, and supported by the petite bourgeoisie, desperate for the reimposition of social order. Well, what does that say about the present? As we know, in the German elections, we've seen Alternative for Deutschland make significant gains, particularly in the east of Germany. Now, the question is, of course, is it accidental that it is in the east of Germany? Not only because the east of Germany has suffered from deindustrialization as a consequence of German reunification, but also because arguably some of the features that one sees in populist right-wing parties were also features of Stalinism. How else do you make sense of the nonsense of socialism in one country, but as a nationalist movement, effectively as a nationalist position to take? And then the question starts to rise, well, is George Galloway actually on the left? Is Sarah Wagenknecht? So we know that those parties in the Federal Republic of Germany were absolutely hammered. By contrast, Sarah Wagenknecht did reasonably well compared, for example, to the SPD. And as we know, very soon elections will follow in Brandenburg, and the Alternative for Deutschland is second in national opinion polls. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Ian. Excellent introduction. I've never heard it say like a petite bourgeoisie. That sounds very, very cute. Okay, over to you, Matthew.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I think that what Ian said is useful. Is the question, the characterization, in terms of what is a fascist, and how do we characterize the current state? And what I'm trying to do is have a run through what we're looking at in terms of Europe, and also, I mean, I think clearly relating to the US as well, and then go through some of the stuff that's happened recently in this country in terms of rights and so on. So in those terms, I mean, what you're really looking at, obviously, is the rise of a far right movement, which is, apart from anything else, very well funded. And you can look through all the different countries, whether that's France or Italy or Hungary, Sweden, and so on. That clearly there is a lot of money in this. Even going down to our own dear Stephen Yaxley Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson, who receives, is actually on a subsidy, for his operations. And a lot of that actually then also relates to what's happening in the US as well, because obviously the rise of Trump and the far right in the US is, then supplies money. It's also a question of, some of the people around Trump, Bannon and so on and so forth, Miller, are actually, very either fascist or very close to being fascist, and are playing a role in terms of organising the far right and the fascists across the world. Whether that's in Europe or in Latin America or in the US. So there is definitely this notion of having an international organisation, of a larger and more organised type than the left has put together at this point. So in those terms, I mean, but what we're dealing with, I think, is it's a different era, isn't it? I mean, what we've dealt with, what Ian's really dealt with has been the the point to which the ruling class actually ceded universal suffrage. I mean, most countries, I mean, ceded universal suffrage, etc., and the full version of bourgeois democracy, in which the democratic function was incorporated into the bourgeois state after the Russian Revolution itself. I mean, it was one of those things. They conceded that, because actually, in an effort to prevent any social overturn. Now, of course, what we're seeing is the decline and the decay of that system. It's quite clear, in which lots of people don't vote, in which people are alienated clearly from the whole system, and you can see why. The kind of things that are on offer, the fact that actually, of course, at the moment, of course, whoever you vote for, you get the same neoliberal crud, and enormous amounts of frustration. Plus, of course, the crushing of systematic crushing of living standards, and now, of course, moving towards increasing repression in terms of repression of free speech, organisation, etc., which we can see in this country to a degree, and which obviously is happening elsewhere as well, as the capitalist class moves towards war, moves towards an increasing authoritarian forms of rule just to maintain itself. So, I mean, we see these formations. I mean, they're not. I mean, whether that's the National Rally in France, or the Sweden Democrats, or so on, or Meloni in Italy, or Orban in Hungary, they're not classic fascist formations. The classic fascist formations obviously have with them, essentially a street army, which is what Ian was talking about in terms of the SR. For the crushing of the workers' movement and so on. In some cases, these organisations have actually divested themselves of their street army, the likes of the Sweden Democrats or Meloni in Italy. They've actually deliberately got rid of that. Now, I mean, the peculiar one, of course, is Meloni, because I mean, she does actually come from a fascist tradition. She is by sort of political upbringing and tradition a fascist. She actually was against the particularly obviously the guy called Fini, who tried to moderate the fascist tradition, and there was a huge falling out in terms of the Italian fascist tradition, and they basically said, well, you're going against what we believe in, and we'll basically exile you and so on. And so Meloni was central to that, because she was obviously one of the head people, honchos in the youth movement. But as soon as she's assumed power, of course, now she started suing people who call her a fascist. And of course, there's an immense amount of evidence that, of course, that's what she is. It's certainly her political tradition. But it's a different form, as I say, and one in which also, of course, the other thing it relates to, in particular, as did to a degree the fascists, the Nazis in particular, of course, is the Zionist movement. Now, Zionism, of course, is a much more significant movement now than it was in the 20s and 30s, in which it was a tiny minority of the Jewish community, which, of course, in itself was far less significant in terms of its economic or political power than it is now. So Zionism actually then, and not just Israeli Zionism, but also, of course, the Zionist base in the US, which is very rich, has played a major role in subsidising these guys, including Tommy Robinson. So we have actual open anti-Semites, people who are, and there's a whole series of them, and you can go through, and all these organisations generally have a tradition of anti-Semitism, who are then have this arrangement with the Zionists, which is not strange in terms of how the Zionists, as Tony Greenstein so helpfully pointed out in his book, not different to the relationship the Zionists had with the Nazis either. That of course the Zionists, of course, are quite happy to work with anti-Semites, because exactly the two projects coincide, i.e. the notion that Jews only should live in Israel and not anywhere else. So in those terms, you can see that sort of strange contradiction playing itself out. Now, the thing is, I mean, okay, for facing this different beast, what is it? It has some elements of fascism, but not certainly in all of them. And the question really is also, how do you confront it? I think there's also the other thing. The final piece I was going to say, and I'll go through a few slides, I hope, if I can, on the riots. So in terms of, I'm hoping everybody can see that. So in terms of, the thing is, in terms of what happens in the riots in this country, I think the important thing really is the growth of the Reform Party in the election, which of course was promoted by the usual suspects as a racist organisation, as an openly racist organisation, gets 4 million votes, is allowed to basically walk over a lot of electoral laws. I mean, for instance, here in Glasgow, they stood those candidates. Nobody's ever seen these people. They may not exist. They gave false addresses to stand. The agent's address given in my constituency was the hardware store up the road from me. And this is clearly permitted, because obviously if the left did any such thing, there would be an absolute outcry and people would be prosecuted and so on. But this is fine, because obviously this is a force which is of use. So based on that, obviously, then you have this big Tommy Robinson rally on July the 27th in London, which is the biggest. I mean, unfortunately, it's the biggest gathering of racists, and the counter isn't exactly built huge, and is certainly much smaller than the actual rally, which is probably estimated between 20 and 30,000 people. And this gives the group, obviously gives them heart that they can fill Trafalgar Square per this picture. So a day after that, we have the stabbings in Southport, and of course, the difference being at the moment, we don't really have a fascist or a far-right organisation in this country. What we have is a series of social media networks, and some people who make a lot of money at that. And even some of this stuff was run through Channel 3 operation, which is based in Pakistan. And this gave out all this false information about the guy who did the stabbings in Southport. So then what you get is a series of outbreaks in different areas. After the initial gathering in Southport on 30th of July, in which we get people basically coming to Southport from all around the northwest Merseyside and so on, and attempting to attack the local mosque. So that pattern then repeats. And we can see that going through the country. And so in some cases they're opposed, and we get turnout, particularly I think through the Stand Up to Racism, which of course is the front. I'll be interested to know what people actually know of the operation of Stand Up to Racism in England. Certainly here in Glasgow, it's basically viewed as a very disreputable organisation because of its relationship to Glasgow Friends of Israel, widely loathed in the Palestinian movement and on the left because of that. And if people want to ask questions about it, I can go into more of it. So what we see then is a series of these riots, basically targeting either mosques or hotels in which people are being accommodated as asylum seekers. Essentially, what you're seeing also, of course, is a rising that's based on alienation, on communities, and which is not actually interestingly youth based. I mean, there's a whole you look at the number of people who've been arrested. I mean, the age range is amazing. I think there was one guy in his 80s was actually convicted from these riots, and numbers of people in their 50s and 40s and so on. So it wasn't. Although, of course, obviously you see kids as well, because clearly it's exciting and the rest of it. So then run through different. Now, I'm hoping this is going to move. come on, business in terms.
Matthew, are you stuck? Sorry, I think the internet is not great where Matthew is. Matthew, can you hear us? Yeah, I think he's gotten stuck there. Matthew? Okay, I think I have to switch that off. Matthew, I think possibly if you can't hear us, you might want to have to try and rejoin. And I'm going to try to stop him sharing. Apologies, comrades. Oh, there's Ian. Okay, yes, I think Matthew is trying to rejoin, which is good. It might solve some issues. Let's discuss then quickly while we're waiting, Ian, for Matthew. I think Matthew sort of agrees probably with what you would say, i.e. that these are not proper fascist organizations that we are seeing today. They have some fascists in them, but you've been saying it's important to have a clear definition, presumably because, you know, once the real thing comes, we want to have being able to have words to describe what's happening. So where do you see like the biggest issues are? Why wouldn't you call today's protests fascist, or what would you call them? Are they right-wing populist movements, perhaps? And if we don't call them fascists, does it matter?
I think right-wing populist is pretty good. I mean, it's a reasonably good description of what you see. I think certainly when I've heard people who have expressed support for the Reform Party, they haven't necessarily even been people who have been particularly racist. Racist in the classic sense. They don't think black people are inferior. They don't dislike black people. It's a question of competition for scarce jobs and housing. And that's an important distinction to make. So although some of them are undoubtedly racist, that doesn't mean to say they all are. And what I think what we should be doing, I think, is to drive a wedge between those. The numbers of people who are genuinely fascist or genuinely racist in the sort of people who would support the Reform Party are going to be very, very small indeed. The very worst you can do is to say, well, you're all fascists. So you drive them all into the arms of the more fascistic elements. In a sense, it's kind of the opposite of what was taking place in Germany. You know, a wedge was driven between groups of workers, communists on the one hand, social democrats on the other, but ultimately workers. And the point about the United Front was the idea of uniting as workers against the possibility of the Nazis taking power. And that would have been extremely important. What we'll do if we just talk about the Reform Party as a bunch of fascists, or just point the finger at football supporters who happen to have tagged along to a Tommy Robinson march and say you're all fascists, well, they'll say, well, okay, well, we're fascists then. If that's going to annoy you, we'll identify as fascists. The fact is, though, who are we talking about? We're not necessarily talking about a lumpen proletariat. I don't deny for a moment that.
What happened now? The second speaker is gone. Ian, can you hear me? Okay, the second speaker has got a technical problem. Comrades, if anybody's got a question or would like to make a comment, please click raise hand and we can bring you in and discuss the issues further. I think Ian made a point that was also is also a case in Germany with the AfD, where also an attempt was made for a long time to shun the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland. And basically nobody talked to them, nobody discussed with them, they weren't allowed be invited to meetings, etc. So there was a lot of an attempt to basically no platform them, and that totally did not work at all. So you had, the more you pushed them aside, the more popular they became. And like Ian says about the Reform Party, I think in the AFD, you have a lot of alienated people and people who want to put two fingers up to the ruling coalition, and they've done that very, very well. So there's a different issues going on there, and I think where Ian was just going to go with this description is also that no platforming is probably not going to help getting rid of them, and no platforming is not going to help demystifying them. Quite the opposite. So if you shut them up, you allow them to look like martyrs. Probably is what he's going to say. I think he would. There he is back. Ian.
Good evening, comrades. I've actually suffered a complete power cut, so
oh my God.
I'm running on battery power here using my phone.
How strange! In the middle of the session.
Yeah. It's a fascist national grid.
Absolutely. So I was just there's a couple of comments who want to come in, but just to clarify, I mean, in terms of no platforming, and that's probably where you would disagree with Matthew and probably some people in the audience as well. So an attempt was made in Germany to no platform the AFD for many years, and it basically, I think, led to the opposite. They became more popular. What do you think about the idea of no platform? And we're talking about as well the left. Should we shun them and not talk to them at all?
I'm wholly opposed to no platform policies. I should just explain perhaps the background to my opposition to them. I was very active in student union politics when I was at university in 1984 to 1988. No platform for racists and fascists was a common theme in student union politics, and one which I supported at the time. I supported it on the grounds that the fascists that were on campus were likely to physically and in other ways intimidate people from international students and so on. However, there was a moment at what was then the Sunderland Polytechnic, which I think had come under the influence of the Socialist Workers' Party, and the no platform policy was enacted by the Sunderland Polytechnic Students' Union to effectively disaffiliate the Union of Jewish Students on the grounds that because they were Zionists, that they were therefore racists. Now, the problem about that, of course, is that once you start disaffiliating people, or you start withdrawing the right to speak, then what you get eventually is that's applied to the right. In practice as well, what happened was there was some fantastic debates, and the people who were most passionately opposed to what was going on were those anti-Zionist Jewish speakers who came along and denounced Zionism. And of course, these are the people now who would be dismissed as the wrong sort of Jew. These are the people now who would have their right to speak removed from them. So I developed my opposition to no platform policies then, and nothing has happened since to change my mind on it.
So it is, I mean, as socialists, we believe in majority revolution, when we don't believe in a coup of a small minority of hardened communists. We actually want the majority of the population to be behind it. And the majority is clearly at the moment not behind socialism. So we actually need to win them over. And I think that's what makes an opposition to no platforming quite important, that we actually talk to people and try and change their mind. We might not change the mind of Tommy Robinson. I mean, he's lost, I would have thought. But some of the people who look at him for answers, if you organize a debate and you show that he doesn't have answers, then that's surely a good thing. You've gone now almost entirely black, because it's dark outside, isn't it?
No, I've actually gone to try and find a torch.
Yeah, or some candles or something. Well, you go and find, oh, look at that. Oh, like a ghost. No, actually, that looks okay. That looks okay. If your battery keeps going. Yeah. Did you want to say anything else on the issue, or shall we bring some comrades in from the floor now?
Yeah, it certainly brings some comrades in the floor, but I agree with what you're saying. I think that the last thing we want to do is actually create the conditions for groups of fascist or other right wingers who can feel aggrieved in some way. All my experience of people on the far right, and this includes even Zionists. I'm not saying all Zionists are on the far right, but once they actually get to speak, they reveal themselves for the fools they are. It's very easy to destroy their arguments. And if you have no platform, what's your opportunity to do that?
Absolutely. I think we might have some opposition to that outlook from the floor, which is always interesting because we like a good discussion. Harry.
Yes, okay, I think I'm on.
Yeah.
Hi, I mean, the question is that who benefits from the rise of fascism? And I mean, if you go back to the 1920s, the rise of Hitler that began there, he was supported by the Western powers. And then there was a threat. The threat was the Soviet Union after the 1917 revolution. Today, it's a very different picture because the threat of the interests and the privileges of Western corporations is no longer the Soviet Union. It's from the people. It's revolution and people organizing against the corporations. Now, this far-right ideology is effectively decades in the making. It's been going on. And, on my social media, someone put up front page headlines from the likes of the Daily Mails and the Daily Express, littered with, migrants coming in, migrants taking over the country, all new jobs going to migrants, and so on and so on. And that has been building up. And I think there's no question it has got a relatively sizable support amongst ordinary working class people. We could call them the lumpen proletariat. But even when you look at trade unions, if you listen to them, they have a problem with this far-right ideology amongst trade unionists. And the problem they're not doing is they're not really challenging this in any effective manner. They're just trying to downplay it, and hopefully that it'll go away. When you look at today and look at the way Europe is going, I mean, we're really seeing them, in my opinion, the breakup of the European Union, and that is going towards the nation state, and particularly in Germany. Germany being the largest economy is in stagnation, and there's now huge problems within that country. And as I think Matthew and Andy related to, that a vote in the regional Thuringia, but also in Saxony, was the first time that a far-right party has taken power in that region effectively since, I think, in 1932 when Hitler came to power. And the size of the vote was around 30%. It outdid the SPD and the Greens, the Free Democrats, both put together. That's a very, very serious development. And that's going on. I think, to be honest with you, the perspective within Europe is unfortunately towards that trend as Europe breaks up more and more towards the nation state. One of the problems is, one, is the conditions are ripe to build the far right. We have governments all over Europe that have followed the same agenda, just like the UK. They're not going to seriously deal with the fundamental problems in this country. It's not going to happen under Stammer or any other government. It's going to be more of the same as vicious attacks on the working class. That is going to feed into the far-right agenda. The second thing is, and this is what's happened in Germany and indeed other countries, is these social democratic parties are effectively not challenging it head on. They're playing into it. They're moving themselves alleging that there is a serious migrant problem, refugee problem, and they themselves are out doing it. They themselves are saying, okay, we need to stop the boats coming in, we need to deal with the migrants coming in. It's a serious crisis. And that is feeding directly in to the far right ideology. It's almost reinforcing their program and aiding their program in building the far right. So the Labour Party is, by the way, no exception to that at all. They're feeding exactly the same thing. The big question is, what do we do? They've got the mass media. Farage has the mass media. Trump has the mass media. And the mass media are all over that. So they have a direct communication with their far-right ideology. We don't have that. As much as we have is social media at the very best. And we've got to use that with the resources that we have. To me, what we need to do is we need to link up all the anti-fascist groups, link them up as best we can, coordinate, so that at least we can get the message out there to social media. At the moment, we are outnumbering them in any of their protests. Certainly the ones here in Northern Ireland, we've massively outswamped them. But that's not to say in my opinion, I believe they're still winning, even though they're small numbers. They're winning the war. We may be winning a battle, but they're winning the war in this game. And we need to start getting out there on our platforms, getting the message across, directly taking this issue amongst the people, but linking it up internationally, because our resources are very small. Their resources are massive, but we need to take them on. In my opinion, and maybe I may disagree with Ian on a lot of things he said, these are fascist groups. Farage, I don't care what you say about him, his agenda is fascism. Trump's agenda is fascism. The coup attempt, he has already said that he will actually, if he becomes president, he may well ignore the American Constitution again. Fascism. Italy, that is a fascist organization, government in Italy. And we're seeing it now in other countries, possibly now Germany. That is the trend. This is serious in my opinion. And it's up to us really to take them on by uniting and taking the message forward in the only way possible, through social media and public protests. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Harry. I mean, I would say that we also need to build a political party. The left needs to build a political party with a principled program. I mean, because you look at Germany, the BSW, the Sarah Wagenknecht party, which is sort of the left, is anti-migrants, as is, you could argue, George Galloway's Workers' Party. They are, rather than challenging this, they are feeding the same, the populist answers, the easy answers. It's them who are causing this issue.
Well, to me, they should be included in an anti-fascist movement, a political. I'm not sure we're going to ever achieve one political party that's going to stand up against fascism. I can't see that happening. I just can't. We're too split. The socialist organizations are splintered. We're all scattered, and we won't. But we've got to try to work on this issue together. So by all means, but I can't see one party. I just can't see it, Tina. I can't see it.
Can't see it at the moment, unfortunately, but it is what is needed. Ian, what do you think? Can you hear us, Ian? Ian is stuck again. I was going to mention also, which hasn't been.
There's a couple of things. Firstly,
So you were stuck, but now we can hear you again. Go on. Go on, Ian.
The first thing is, internationalism is not some kind of add-on part of the Marxist program. If we're not in favour of socialism worldwide, the idea that you could achieve it in Britain or even the European Union is fanciful. If you couldn't achieve it in the Russian Empire, the size of 1/5 of the land surface of the world, what are our chances in some smaller country? So it's internationalist or it's nothing. The other aspect of it, of course, is if we look at what are the competition for scarce jobs and housing. I mean, we're looking at people who are, how desperate do you have to be to spend every penny you've got trying to get across the channel in a dinghy only to be shoved in a detention centre. And for that to be preferable, how bad does it have to be from where you came from? I can understand it for a lot of people. So what do we then do? As communists, we have to have a plan for the world. There has to be a plan for the redevelopment of those areas which have been completely destroyed by capitalism in general, imperialism in particular. And on the question of imperialism, we also have to look at the effect of imperialism on our own populations. I mean, the fact that British workers have been supporting the Reform Party should be of concern. But and of course, if we're to explain it, an explanation, I think, rests not with mass psychology or something. I think the explanation rests with the imperialist history of the United Kingdom and now, of course, the United States and other countries in the world. The question is, to what extent are people prepared to defend their petty privileges against other people? Certainly, when working in the health service would collapse overnight without the excellent work of many migrant workers there, many of whom have been expressly recruited in India, in Africa, to make up workforce shortfalls. The other aspect of it, and as I say, this also applies to things like the Workers' Party of Britain. It's not accidental that Ernst Röhm, for example, was a member of the German Workers' Party. Fascism often dresses itself up in a socialistic garb. It's not accidental that the Nazi flag was red. It was a deliberate choice to pass oneself off as a socialist in some way. It is an important part of the fascist playbook. Now, again, I'm not suggesting for one moment that George Galloway's Workers' Party of Britain is fascist or fascistic, but I do think that it is extremely worrying that they should embrace, for example, bits of British nationalism to suit themselves. I mean, the Workers' Party's logo was clearly influenced by the Royal Air Force roundel. You know, this is whatever else this is. This isn't communism. This isn't a communist party. This isn't a Marxist party. But at the same time, you know, we as communists have to make that critique, and we have to argue for internationalism and a communist transformation of the world. Otherwise, we just end up in the numbers game. You know, how many immigrants is enough, or too many, or whatever else.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah. Sorry, I think it's also worth discussing that it's not just the issue of immigration. I think that makes the organizations like the AfD attractive to so many people. Like in Germany, it's the main opposition party when it comes to the war in Ukraine, for example. They are putting forward, motions everywhere, etc., and organizing demonstrations against the war in Ukraine, whereas the left, the Linke Party, is extremely quiet on it. Sarah Wagenknecht as well is her party is outspoken, but I think that also is a reflective in other countries where the left is not challenging those issues and is walking behind imperialism in its various adventures. Israel, Palestine, another issue. That's not where the AfD is so strong, but that is a huge, in Germany, it's a huge issue, the Ukraine war, and lots of people are not in favor of it anymore. And yet, the pipeline was blown up with, it looks very much the cooperation of the German government and, denying German people and industry cheap gas, etc., all for a war that is unwinnable. So it's another issue we should say. It's not just about migrants, because there are other issues at stake here. Okay, there's a couple of people with their hands up, and I also can see Matthew seems to have been able to rejoin. So let's take a few questions from the floor and then bring in Matthew again as well. Hi, James.
Hi, yeah. I remember going on the anti-capitalist resistance website. They had some good articles. I think we forgot to mention like the United Popular Front in France, an alliance of Greens and Socialists and Communists. So, and I think feminists as well. So I think there is some sort of hope, especially when you look to France, where they look like they were far behind, and there was some sort of grassroots movement. So it's good to see the Greens and the Socialists and Communists uniting.
Have you finished? So I think you have, yeah.
Good to have you.
Thank
No,
you.
no, but sure.
I'll take a couple of other people. Adrian, a woman. Women get positive discriminated here. Hi, Adrian.
Yeah, well, I'm a U.S. Trotskyist, and our party has existed since the 1960s. And currently, the thing with Trump and Biden, they're both, totally in with murdering the Palestinians. And so they are, very classic ruling class capitalist parties. And with this current election, obviously everybody, a lot of people are terrified of Trump. And so it's been our policy has been to try to promote the idea of working for a Labor Party in the United States, which doesn't exist. So at least, you can't tell. Well, we will not vote for Biden or Kamala Harris. We won't vote for, because they're the ruling class. They're like Blair, But the whole thing is that people are Trump, which in some ways is logical, but there really is movement against Trump. But everybody is piling, of course, into the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is one of the biggest obstacles to the working class because, it's a false flag, I know that's probably not the right term. So I do think that Trotsky's writings on this are really urgent. And the idea of working with the Social Democrats. For us, the Democratic Socialists of America, I don't know if they're exactly, I guess they are Social Democrats. They believe in voting. And so we need to be working with them. And it's important, I think, not to drive that wedge. On the one hand, to define fascism and not, refrain from it, but not to just call, as you're right, the left calls everybody fascist that they don't like. And the particular definition is very important. So that's what we're trying to do. We have a meeting on this Sunday of people who went to the Democratic National Convention, to protest against Kamala and for Palestine. So that'll be this Sunday. And I actually put it in the chat. People can link in online. And it's a very fraught time. I'm Jewish, and Zionism has turned into it never was anything really progressive, but it's turned into its total opposite, being Jewish. It's because it's got the ruling class behind it. It's the ruling class all over the place. We got to take them down. And I know that you all know that. And I don't know what else there is to do, but I think socialism and feminism are just completely crucial to promote and not to, give in to the sexism and misogyny and people who are just, desperate for any answer, even if it doesn't help. I don't know if that helps or not, but, it's quite fraught times here in the United States as it is everywhere.
Thank you, comrade. William.
Right, well, I wanted to get in on the discussion on Kneecap. I live in the north of Ireland, but I don't live in the occupied zone of the north of Ireland. I live in Donegal, which is the most northern part of Ulster, and it's also a Gaelic-speaking part. Kneecap has been going around for about 15 years now. They were quite a young group when they started off. They've come out of a nationalist ghetto in East Belfast, Ballymurphy and places like that. They speak Gaelic. Now, that's because Gaelic is an anti-establishment language in West Belfast. The PSNI can't speak it. And if you don't want to coerce with it or speak with it, converse with the PSNI, you use Irish. And then they had a campaign for true language rights. Now, it is, when they say it's a bullet against British imperialism, it most certainly is. Now, they have their own accent of Irish, and where I live, it's known as a Gaeltacht area. A Gaeltacht is an area where Irish is the vernacular, but the local people say they speak Gaeltacht Irish. And the reason for that is they would have learned it off their fathers and their uncles and their brothers that would have been locked up in long cash and imprisoned without charge and all that sort of thing. And that was a way that inside in the prisons they were able to not cooperate with the authorities in the prisons. So they really developed their own type of language, their own accent anyway, Belfast accent. Like I speak Gaelic with a Dublin accent, and that's because I'm from Dublin. But the people say I speak book Irish because I learned it out of a book. Now the thing about the Irish language is it died during the famine. 75% of the people spoke Irish before when the famine started, and only about 30% spoke it at the end of the famine, which was in 3 years. The famine killed the language. It reduced the population from 8 million down to 3 million in about 4 years. Now, people that had native Irish speakers and learn Irish as a second language, Irish people find it's a very it's a very spiritual thing. They get they're learning about themselves, and they realise that the English they speak is really laced with Irish because they have a grammar, and a lot of the grammar in English that's spoken in English-speaking parts of Ireland is actually Irish grammar. Sometimes the British say that the Irish speak backwards. That's because, well, I'll give you an example. If you were talking about a small boy in English, you would say, if you were talking about the same boy in Irish, you would say boogle biog, which is boy small, and that sort of thing. And when the Irish came after the famine to England, so the migrants, they were learning English, but they were using Irish grammar. And the English used to laugh at them. Oh, everybody's saying he's talking backwards and all that sort of thing. But the Kneecap is going for about 15 years, and Kneecap now is causing a revolution among the Irish youth. I even see the young people in this area, which is a very rural area, going to see the film. They've decided that the youth club has decided they've been in contact with Kneecap themselves, with Kneecap themselves, and they're getting permission to show the film in 2 weeks' time. And then they're going to have a big discussion on the Irish language. The people who control the Irish language, the so-called revival of it, do it, very establishment people. They get a lot of grants and all things like that. And they alienate the youth. And that alienates the language. But now, what Kneecap is after doing is after breaking the ice. And the young proletariats are now and the younger people, the younger generation, are beginning to use Irish and see the qualitative value of the language. And it's not only in Ireland. They've already made £1 million, and it's only out since August the 8th, which is not even a month. And it's all over America. It's all Irish ethnic groups in America and in England too, and some of the left-wing groups in England. Now, you said what kind of anarchists are they, or what kind of communists they are. I would put them down as anarcho-communists. They're anarchists. Though they're not conscious anarchists, but they're spontaneous anarchists because they don't believe in discipline of any description. Now, all of the things, the drugs and all that is involved in the film, they are reflecting on their own youthful experiences. They're no longer youths. I'd say they're all in their 30s now. But when they were in their teens, they were up again, the paramilitaries. That's where they got the name Kneecap, because if they were opting out of, they weren't getting involved in the armed struggle, or they weren't getting involved in the politics. They were getting involved in the social issues. They were vulnerable to the drug culture that all of the youth in Britain and Ireland are vulnerable to. Like when I was young, Dragons of cider was the only thing we ever had to worry about. But now there's heroin and ecstasy and all these other things. And that's why they call themselves Kneecap, because the paramilitaries were trying to discipline them, because there was no police force in West Belfast. Like if someone broke into your house in West Belfast, you didn't ring up the RUC or the PSNI as they're called now. You went to the local branch of whatever paramilitary group, the Provos or the Stickies or whoever, and you told them, and they investigated it, and then they ended up kneecapping the delinquents that robbed your house. So Kneecap is creating a cultural revolution in Ireland, and I'm absolutely enjoying it, even though I don't like their music at all.
I was just going to ask you if you're a rap fan. I think it's great. It's very good music, but thanks for that. I didn't know they existed for 15 years. They do look really, really young, but that's
They're in their 30s, so I would say early 30s at this stage.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Brian. Sorry, William. Okay, we have one more person with their hand up, which is Victor, and then we can finish our discussion with Matthew and Ian.
Yes.
Victor, hello.
Did a restart, Lisa.
Hello, I hope you can all hear me.
Yep.
Would like to take his sanity.
Listen, we can only hear, I can only see the top of your head.
Fact about
I don't think your internet is very good, Victor.
that right.
Yeah.
I would like to one glaringly obvious fact that seems to have been totally censored, not only by the establishment and the mainstream media, but to my great surprise, much of the left media as well. And that is this: the question of why terrorism charges have not been applied to the actually Leninist rioters. It would seem odd at first, wouldn't it? However, it's intriguing that these riots waited until a few weeks after Stormtrooper was elected Prime Minister before they happened. They happened aided by false propaganda. And in the intervening few weeks, we saw a Muslim leader, Mr. Chowdhury, given life imprisonment on terrorism charges. Nobody seems to know exactly what terrorism he was involved in, whether he attacked a mosque, whether he set fire to a police car, a station, destroyed a library. Nobody seems to know, but it must have been grievous terrorism because he got life imprisonment for it. We've also seen journalists who report on Palestine, like Mr. Medhurst, arrested at Heathrow Airport for terrorism. And there's another person who's been arrested for terrorism, someone who reported what's happened in Palestine. But clearly, none of the actually Leninist rioters are in any way being charged with terrorism. I would suggest the explanation is quite simple. You may remember when some East London Muslim youths went to join the Islamic State, their parents were charged under terrorism for sending money to help fund them so they could have money for food. And I would suggest the reason why Tommy Robinson's mob are not being charged with terrorism is that if he were charged with terrorism, then the Zionists, the Middle East Foundation, who fund Mr. Robinson and pay his legal bills and fund his organisation, would also be liable for charges for funding terrorism, in the same way as the parents of these kids who went to live in the Islamic State were charged with terrorism. And I'm glad to have been afforded this opportunity to say this, because it's never else been mentioned on the media for some obscure reason, not even on the left-wing media. So thank you very much for this space.
All right, thanks, Victor. Okay, let's bring it back to our two main speakers. Matthew, I'm not sure if you were able to listen too much. Ian dropped out as well with a
No, I know. Sorry, it's
so, I mean, did you hear anything of the discussion? Would you like to reply or finish
well,
bits of
very
your
much the discussion. I just think that we're not dealing with the classic fascism, are we? I mean, we're dealing with something different. I mean, obviously, it is something that the ruling class itself is using. I mean, these guys, clearly, I mean, we can see, I mean, these people are held as being useful, and that everything is being shifted to the right and far right and authoritarianism in any case. And so, clearly that is the process that is going on. So, I mean, in those terms, it is different, but obviously it requires a response in terms of, prevention where possible, but also, of course, really the real thing is the left has to get its act together and present an alternative, because obviously the ruling class itself is driving the process.
Yeah, I mean, you missed the discussion we had on no platforming, which I think is where you possibly disagree with Ian. So it would be interesting to hear your point of view. I mean, let me just put to you the usual argument from people like myself and Ian would be that not platforming drives. If we don't expose their ideas, it drives them underground. It makes them look like martyrs, which is something that we could argue happened with the AfD in Germany, that it was shunned everywhere and it just grew and grew and grew. Whereas if you take them on, if we take on, for example, if Tommy Robinson would come here to discuss with us, we could show that he's got stupid ideas. We could show some of his supporters, we could maybe change their mind, etc. Why do you think we have to draw such a sharp line to as socialists who want to win over as many people as we can?
The problem you've got really is, of course, these people are not, in many cases, not particularly interested in the exchange of ideas. They're interested in intimidating people. And you can see, I mean, even in a city like Glasgow, you can see, in which we don't allow these people to march around or physically, and in most cases, I think we've had a certain issue with some of the Rangers fans in recent time, which has also been because of this upsurge. They've seen themselves the confidence to try and intimidate people. And the effect of that, you can see that coming through, in terms of people's activity in the Palestine movement and how they see, can they walk the street and all that sort of. And so, I mean, in those terms, we have to stop the manifestations of this kind of thing in terms of, racists and so on, and the far right actually, operating on the streets. Because it actually, that they intend to stop us, and they intend to stop people from our side from being active, and particularly to victimize people of color and so on. So I mean, there's no way you can allow that. And I mean, the thing is also, I mean, in terms of I spent together with a number of other comrades, we spent every once a week for a year outside a hotel in Erskine. Because the fascists were the local racists, and one or two who were organised by one or two fascists and so on, were attempting really to stage, some kind of attack, or just at least try and build something around a protest around the hotel, in which asylum seekers were being held by the Home Office. Now, I mean, there's no way we could allow that. And actually what happened, of course, is the actual organised fascists got fed up because we managed to stop them, and they went away, and leaving these sort of very local racist nutcases. There was all, we always outnumbered them. Well, unfortunately, we didn't have the ability to just remove them, which we would have done if we could. But I mean, there's that's the problem. I mean, it's not, in those terms, it's not an exchange of ideas. It's about, who actually has the right to walk down the street, and what streets, and do people have the right to exist without being attacked? So in the, and just won't allow that sort of thing. And the thing is, I mean, in the tradition here in Glasgow is we just won't allow them to move. I mean, you heard of the EDL. There was a Scottish Defence League. It appeared on a bus in Buchanan Street bus station. It went round the corner to a small pub where it was pinned down by about 1,000 people, and the cops told it to get back on its bus, bugger off. It's never been seen again. And it's actually, as I say, that's important, because it's one or t'other. It's us or them in these cases.
I mean, self-defense and defending vulnerable communities is, of course, is a given. I think that's that we're not have different opinions there. Would you like to respond to what Matthew said, Ian?
Exactly. So, holding the streets and stopping the fascists is one thing, but calling for more laws, for more repression, or saying no platform, therefore nobody should be allowed to speak, or you shouldn't be, is something quite different. When you start calling upon the state to defend us from fascists by introducing more laws, we can guarantee that will eventually be used against the left. A number of people have been saying about how weak the left is and how fragmented it is, and of course that's absolutely true. But there are reasons to be cheerful. When the riots broke out and racists were attacking communities, vast numbers of people turned out in response, and I think that's magnificent. Whether they were organised by Stand Up to Racism or whoever they were organised by doesn't really matter. A lot of it was really quite spontaneous. Once the word got out that the communities needed to be defended, people turned out in very large numbers, and made the fascists look ridiculous. And here I'm using the term as a kind of pejorative term. Again, I think we should be more precise about the use of things like fascist or whatever. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean to say there aren't fascists among them. The question is, of course, could they take power? What would the ruling class do? Now, you might get a situation where, for example, Donald Trump takes power. But what then if he chooses to try and act against the Constitution? The Constitution trumps the president, if you'll pardon the pun. And from that point of view, things like the Supreme Court, as part of the whole kind of separation of powers, would have a part to play. It's not inconceivable that a Donald Trump that actually tried to overturn the Constitution unconstitutionally could actually be removed from power. That would be interesting. Now, the idea that the US president has unlimited power to just simply dismiss the Constitution, dismiss the Supreme Court, and so on, is fanciful. There might be a lot of very reactionary people in the United States, but there are vast multitudes of people who would defend the Constitution. And the same goes for many other countries. The idea that the people like Farage, for example, could come in and sort of dispense with the trade union movement. Well, it remains to be seen. Of course, that was the big distinction with fascism in the 30s. Once Hitler had taken power, that was it. The trade unions were suppressed. And just to be playful, he allowed the workers the 1st of May off as International Workers' Day, at the same time, on the same day as he crushed the union. And that fragmented the working class. The question is whether someone like Nigel Farage or the Reform Party or even the Tory Party could do such a thing. My feeling at the moment is not, but absolutely it's vital that we're not complacent about it either.
Absolutely. That's an interesting question, isn't it? Could they take power? And then looking back historically, I mean, as you described early on, fascism came about in order to crush the strong working class movement. That's why the bourgeoisie felt it had to turn to fascism. The working class, the left, the socialist, the communist parties were so strong. They constantly challenged for power. They couldn't take power, but they constantly challenged for power. And the countries were ungovernable. And so a part of the bourgeoisie had thought it had to take the decision to turn to fascism actively. The left is nowhere near that at the moment. There is, it looks like there is no need for the bourgeoisie to support fascism and to support anybody like Nigel Farage, etc., to implement his whatever ridiculous program he has, or the AfD, which wants to expel millions of people from Germany. Matthew, do you think that even without a strong working class, that the danger of fascism rather than fascists and right-wing populists, is it a real danger at the moment?
Well, I just to answer one of the points that Ian made. The problem about the US Constitution, of course, is that the US Supreme Court did actually rule that the president, by which they mean Trump, is immune from any action against any official act. So, as was pointed out, it means that he could officially order, people to be locked up or killed in large numbers, which, of course, he's already said he wants to. And in terms of the problem being, of course, is the system itself is in such a parlous state that the ruling class is prepared to move towards, some pretty heavy-duty authoritarianism, but precisely in order to maintain itself. Under conditions in which, if you look at it, the US is in a bad way in terms, economically, and in terms of its power in the world. It's actually, the whole thing is on very shaky ground, and so hence its extreme determination and through to its vassals. Like the UK and Germany and so on and so forth, in defending Israel, despite whatever vile things it may do, and as obviously as Israel is a key element of the imperialist control of the Middle East. So in those terms, I think it's obviously the situation is different. But we still face the issue of the use of, to clamp down on organisation, on democracy in particular. The whole question of the issue of, will the US still be some form of a democracy is live. There's no question of that. And if that happens, obviously, then that affects the rest of the world drastically as well. There's no the Democratic Party is no defense to that. Obviously, they're in hock to the same ruling class. So in those terms, it's going in that direction. Different, but still dangerous is what I would say.
Farid, you've got your hand up. Do you want to speak? I've allowed you to talk, so you could speak now if you wanted to. It might have been a...
sorry, comrades. I mentioned that it was an accident.
Oh, sorry.
Thank
Okay,
you.
apologies. I didn't see that in the chat. Okay, Ian, do you want to sum up perhaps the discussion tonight?
The ruling class rules. And it's a real thing. It doesn't do it necessarily by a committee. It doesn't necessarily do it in a kind of conspiratorial kind of way. It isn't, but there really is a ruling class, and it really does rule. It will use things like dividing the working class by getting them fighting over the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table quite readily as a tactic. And for example, the ruling class has no problem with immigration. It has no problem with the idea of undercutting workers' wages. But what it will do at the same time is seem to face the other way and say, oh, no, we want to keep the immigrants out. The Conservative Party has never reduced immigration, despite the fact that the Conservative Party, I'm old enough to remember some of the most grotesque racist nonsense in the 1970s, where forced repatriation was official Conservative Party policy. But at the same time, the ruling class wants people it can exploit. And without that, you can't make profits. So that's the whole point about the Labour theory of value. Whether Trump, all leaders are indemnified against their actions. So yes, the Supreme Court seems to have handed the possibility that Trump could kind of rule by diktat. Let's see. Indemnifying a leader against decisions. So, for example, the decision to go to war or do this, that, or the other is one thing. For Trump to be able to take power and simply say, well, we're not going to be any trade unions anymore. We're going to deport everybody who's not a US citizen. What's the ruling class going to say when they're deprived of a workforce? What's the ruling class in Germany going to say if the AfD says, well, we're going to deport 20% of the working population? It's nonsense. And the idea that workers would do nothing, I think, is taking pessimism a little step too far. I think, just in conclusion, internationalism has to be at the heart of what we do, and we can't make concessions to those who would use a left-wing sounding rhetoric to reinforce immigration controls and attacks on immigration, because otherwise that plays directly into the hands of the Tommy Robinsons of the world. The only way in which workers can defend themselves is through unity, not demands for no platform, but through workers' unity and workers acting together.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that the important thing is, obviously, as you say, is rely upon the working class itself to take action against racism and so on and so forth, and not to say, well, it's the state to say, to ban these people. It's not, because obviously, as you say, it will be used against us first, and is being used against us first. I mean, you can see the difference, in terms of the, if you're a Just Stop Oil person on a Zoom call, you can give 5 years, whereas of course if you're merely burning a police car, that only gets you about 18 months.
Although it has to be said, they did impose quite harsh sentences on some of those rioters.
Oh yeah. None of them got to 5 years though.
No. Thank you very much, comrades. That was an interesting discussion, despite having to battle through some technical issues that both of you bang as if there was some conspiracy going on in the background there. Yeah. But we've managed to discuss some of the key issues. So thank you very much both for coming back on and sorting that out. Next week, comrades, we're taking a look at artificial intelligence. I'm really looking forward to that. We're going to have Michael Roberts, the Marxist economist, discussing one aspect, and Rob Gold, another Marxist, also looking at another aspect of Marx's writing on how he could have predicted that, or what he had to say on all those issues. So that's going to be very interesting. See you hopefully next week. Bye-bye, comrades.